Chapter 14. The beginning of the end of the world. Slowly, the door opened, and out there came a figure as tall and straight as the girls, but not so slender. It carried no light, but light seemed to come from it. As it came nearer, Lucy saw that it was like an old man. His silver beard came down to his bare feet in front of his silver hair, hung down to his heels. Behind his robe appeared to be made from the fleece of silver sheep. He looked so mild and grave that once more all the travelers rose to their feet and stood in silence. But the old man came on without speaking to the travelers and stood on the other side of the table opposite to his daughter. Then both of them held up their arms before them and turned to face the east. In that position, they began to sing. I wish I could write down the song, but no one knows who was present. None of those present could remember it. Lucy said afterward that it was high, almost shrill, but very beautiful. A cold kind of song, an early morning kind of song. And as they sang, the gray clouds lifted from the eastern sky and the white patches grew bigger and bigger till it was all white. And the sea began to shine like silver. And long afterwards, but those two sang all the time, the east began to turn red and at last unclouded. The sun came up and out of the sea, and its long level ray shot down the length of the table on the gold and silver on the stone knife. Once or twice before, the Narnians had wondered whether the sun and its rising did not look bigger in these seas than it had looked at home. This time they were certain. There was no mistaking it, and the brightness of its ray on the dew and on the table was far beyond the morning brightness they had ever seen. And as Edmund said afterwards, though lots of things happened on that trip which sound more exciting, that moment was really the most exciting. For now they knew that they had truly come to the beginning of the end of the world. Then something seemed to be flying at them out of the very center of the rising sun. But of course, one couldn't look steadily in that direction to make sure. But presently the air became full of voices, voices which took up the same song that the lady and her father were singing, but in a far wilder tones and in a language no one knew. As soon after they were owners of these voices could be seen, they were birds, large white ones, and they came by the hundreds and thousands and alighted on everything on the grass, on the pavement, on the table, on your shoulders, your hands, your head, until it looked as if a heavy snow had fallen. For like snow, they not only made everything white, but blurred and blunted all shapes. But Lucy looked out from between the wings of the birds that covered her, saw one bird fly to the old man with something in his beak that looked like a little fruit, unless it was like a little live coal, in which it might have been, for it was too bright to look at. And the bird laid it on the old man's mouth. Then the birds stopped their singing and appeared to be very busy about the table. I'm wondering if you can figure out which of the major prophets had an angel put a hot coal on his mouth. That would be a fun thing to look for. Then the birds stopped their singing and appeared to be very busy about the table. When they rose from it again, everything on the table that could be eaten or drunk had disappeared. The birds rose from their meal in the thousands. Maybe you can also tell me what prophet got fed by birds. and hundreds, and carried away all the things that could not be eaten or drunk, such as bones and rinds and shells, and took their flight back to the rising sun. But now, because they were not singing, the whir of their wings seemed to set the whole air a-tremble. And there was a table perched on, pecked clean, and there was the table, pecked clean and empty, and all three lords of Narnia sat still, fast asleep. Now at last the old man turned to the travelers and bade them welcome. Sir, said Caspian, will you tell us how to undo the enchantment which holds these three Narnian lords asleep? I will gladly tell you that, my son, said the old man. To break this enchantment, you must sail to the world's end, or as near as you can come to it, and you must come back without having left at least, and you must come back having left at least one of your company behind. And what must happen to that one? Asked Reepicheep. He must go on to the utter east and never return into the world. That is my heart's desire, said Reepicheep. And we are near the world's end now, sir? Asked Caspian. Have you any knowledge of the seas and lands further east than this? I saw them long ago, said the old man, but it was from a great height. I cannot tell you such things as sailors need to know. Do you mean you were flying in the air? Eustace blurted out. I was a long way above the air, my son, replied the old man. I am Ramadou, but I see that you stare at one another and have not heard this name, and no wonder, for the days when I was a star were ceased long before any of you knew this world, and all of the constellations have changed. Golly, said Edmund under his breath. He is a retired star. Aren't you a star any longer? Asked Lucy. I am a star at rest, my daughter, answered Ramadou. When I set for the last time, I was carried into this land, and I am so old now as I was then. Every morning, a bird brings me a fiery berry from the valley of the sun, and each fireberry takes away a little of my age. And when I have become as young as a child again, that was born yesterday, then I shall take my rising again, for we are at Earth's eastern rim, and once more tread the great dance. In our world, said Eustace, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. Even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it's made of. And in this world, you have already met a star, for I think you have been with Corican. Is he a retired star too? Asked Lucy. Well, not quite the same, said Ramadou. It's not quite as the rest. It was not quite as a rest that he was set to govern the Duffers. You might call it a punishment. He might have shone for thousands of years more than the southern winter sky if all had gone well. What did he do, sir? Asked Caspian. My son, said Ramadou, it is not for you, a son of Adam, to know the faults a star can commit. But come, we waste time at such talk. Are you resolved? Will you go further east and come again, leaving one to return no more, and so break the enchantment? Or will you go westward? Surely, sire, said Reepicheep, there is no question about that. It is very plainly part of our quest to rescue these three lords from enchantment. I think the same, Reepicheep, replied Caspian, and even if it were not so, it would break my heart not to go as near the world's end as the drawn tether will take us. but I am thinking of the crew. They signed on to seek the seven lords, not to reach the rim of the earth. If we sail east from here, we shall have to find the edge of the utter east, and no one knows how far that is. They're brave followers, but I see signs that some of them are weary of the voyage and long to have our prow pointing toward Narnia again. I don't think I should take them further without their knowledge and consent. And then there's the poor Lord Roop. He's a broken man. My son, said the star, it would be no use, even though you wished it so, to go to sail for the world's end with men unwilling or men deceived. That is not how great enchantments are achieved. They must know where they go and why. But who is this broken man you speak of? Caspian told Ramadou the story of Roop. I can give him what he needs most, said Ramadou. In this island, there is a sleep without stint or measure, and sleep in which no faintest footfall of dream was ever heard. Let him sit beside these other three and drink oblivion until your return. Oh, do let's do that, Caspian, said Lucy. I'm sure it's just what he would love. At that moment, they were interrupted by the sound of many feet and voices. Drurian and the rest of the ship's company were approaching. They halted in surprise when they saw Ramadou and his daughter. And then, because they were obviously great people, every man uncovered his head. Some sailors eyed the empty dishes and flagons on the table with eyes filled with regret. My lord, he said to Crindurian, pray send 2 men back to the Dawn Treader with a message to Lord Roop. Tell him that the last of his old shipmates are here asleep without dreams, and that he can share it. When this had been done, Caspian told the rest to sit down and laid the whole situation before them. When he had finished, there was a long silence and some whispering until presently the master bowman got up to his feet and said, what some of us have been wanting to ask for a long time, Your Majesty, is how we're ever supposed to get home when we do turn, whether we turn here or someone else. It's been west and northwest winds all the way, barring an occasional calm. And if that doesn't change, I'd like to know what hopes we have of seeing Narnia again. There's not much chance of supplies lasting while we row all the way. That's landsman's talk, said Drurian. There's always a prevailing west, and in these seas all through the late summer, and it's always changes for the new year. We'll have plenty of wind for sailing westward, more than we shall from all accounts. That's true, master, said the old sailor, who was a gilliman by birth. You get some ugly February, and by your leaves, see, I was in command of the ship, I'd say for a winter here, and began a voyage home in March. What'd you eat while you were wintering here? Asked Eustace. This table, said Ramadou, will be filled with the king's feast every day at sunset. Now you're talking, said several sailors. Your Majesties and gentlemen and ladies and all, said Renef, there's just one thing I want to say. There's not one of us chaps who was pressed on the journey. We're volunteers. And there's some here that are looking very hard at that table and thinking about King's feasts, who were talking very loud about adventure on the day we sailed from Carpar Vale, and swearing they wouldn't come home until we'd found the end of the world. And there were some standing on this quay who would have given all they had to come with us. It was thought a finer thing than to have a cabin boy's berth on the Dawn Treader than to wear a knight's belt. I don't know if you get the hang of what I'm saying, but what I mean to say is, I think, chaps, who set out like us will look as silly as those duffel pods if we come home and say we got to the beginning of the world's end and hadn't the heart to go further. Some of the sailors cheered at this, but some said that it was all very well. This isn't going to be much fun, whispered Edmund to Caspian. What are we to do if half these folks hang back? Wait, said Caspian, as he whispered back, I've still a card to play. Aren't you going to say anything, Reep? Whispered Lucy. Nope. Why should your majesty expect it? Answered Reepicheep in a voice that most people heard. My own plans are made. Well, I can. I sail east in the Dawn Treader. When she fails me, I paddle east in my coracle. When she sinks, I shall swim east with my forepaws, and when I can swim no longer, if I have not reached Aslan's country or shot over the edge of the world in some vast cataract, I shall sink with my nose to the sunrise, and Pikacheep will be the bead of the talking mice in Narnia. Hear, hear, said a sailor. I'll say the same. Having the bit about the coracle, which he wouldn't, barring the bit about the coracle, which wouldn't help here, bear me, and adding a lower voice, I'm not going to be outdone by a mouse. At this point, Caspian jumped to his feet. Friends, he said, I think you have not quite understood our purpose. You talk as if we had come to you with our hat in hand, begging for shipmates, but it isn't like that at all. We and our royal brother and sister and their kinsman and Sir Reepicheep, the good knight, and the Lord Drurian have an errand to the world's edge. If it is our pleasure to choose from among you, each of you as our willing, those with whom we deem worthy of so high an enterprise. We have not said that any can come for the asking. That is why we shall now command the Lord Drurian and Master Rents to consider carefully what men among you are the hardiest in battle, the most skilled seamen, the purest in blood, and the most loyal to our person, and the cleanest of life and manners, and to give those names to us in a schedule. He paused and went on in a quicker voice. Aslan's mane, he exclaimed. Do you think that the privilege of seeing the last things is to be brought for a song? Why, every man that comes with such bequeath the title of Dawn Treader to all his descendants, and when we land in Cape Paravel on the homeward voyage, shall have either gold or land enough to make him rich all of his life. Now, scatter over the island, all of you. In half an hour's time, I shall receive the names of that Lord Drurian brings to me. There was a rather sheepish silence, and then the crew made their bows and moved away, one in this direction and one in that, but mostly in little knots and bunches talking. And now for Lord Roop, said Caspian. But turning to the head of the table, he saw that Roop was already there. He had arrived silent and unnoticed while the discussion was going on, and was seated by the Lord Argaz. The daughter of Ramadou stood beside him as if she had just helped him into his chair. Ramadou stood behind him and laid both his hands on Roop's gray head. Even in daylight, a faint silver came from the hands of the star. There was a smile on Roop's haggard face. He held out one of his hands to Lucy and the other to Caspian. For a moment it looked as if he were going to say something. Then his smile brightened as if he were feeling some delicious sensation. A long sigh of contentment came from his lips. His head fell forward, and he slept. Poor Rube, said Lucy. I am glad. He must have had terrible times. Don't let's think of it, said Eustace. Meanwhile, Caspian's speech, helped perhaps by some magic on the island, was having just the effect he intended. A good many who had been anxious enough to get out of this voyage felt quite differently about being left out of it. And of course, whenever any one sailor announced that he had made up his mind to ask for permission to sail, the ones who hadn't said this felt that they were getting fewer and more uncomfortable, so that before a half hour was nearly over, several people were positively sucking up to Drearian and Rents, at least that's what they called it at my school, to get a good report. And soon there were only 3 left who didn't want to go, and those 3 were trying very hard to persuade the others to stay with them. And very shortly after that, 3, there was only 1 left. And in the end, he began to be afraid of being left behind, all on his own, and changed his mind. At the end of the half hour, they all came moping back to Aslan's table and stood at one end while Drearian and Rents went and sat down and with Caspian and made their report. And Caspian accepted all the men but that one who had changed his mind at the last moment. His name was Cream, and he stayed on the island of the Star all the time the others were away looking for the world's end, and he very much wished he had gone with them. He wasn't the sort of man who would enjoy talking to Ramadou and Ramadou's daughter, not to him. No, they to him. And it rained a good deal, and though there was a wonderful feast on table every night, he didn't very much enjoy it. He said it gave him the creeps sitting there alone and in that rain, and as likely as not, and with 4 lords asleep at the end of the table. And when the others returned, he felt so out of things that he deserted on the voyage home in the Lone Islands and went and lived with the colorman, where he was told wonderful stories about the adventures to the end of the world, until at last he came to believe them himself. So you may say, in a sense, that he lived happily ever after, but he could never bear mice. That night, they were all ate and drank together at the great table between the pillars, where the feast had magically renewed. And the next morning, the Dawn Treader set sail once more, just when the great birds had come and gone again. Lady, said Caspian, I hope to speak with you again when I have broken the enchantment. And Ramadou's daughter looked at him and smiled. And that's the end of chapter 14.